You're listening to Indications by the Conference Board.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Liu, and I'm joined once again by my guest, Bart van Ark, our chief economist here at the Conference Board. The topic today is the debt situation in the global economy. Bart, the issue of debt seems to have entered the political discourse again in recent times. Isn't this an issue of all times, and why then has it become much more important and much more loud in the media sphere recently?
Thanks, Jonathan. Yes, the debt issue, which has been an issue in many economies for decades, has recently received quite a bit more attention. And that's especially so in the United States, where we're beginning to warm ourselves up for the campaign season for the presidential elections, end of 2019. But underlying it are really two reasons. First is that the global debt, and that combines government and consumer and corporate debt altogether, has significantly increased in recent decades. So some recent numbers from the International Monetary Fund show that collectively we owe each other today $185 trillion US dollars, and that's about 2.25 times the size of global GDP. So those are huge numbers. And just for comparison, some 30, 40 years ago, that relationship was only 1-to-1. So there is quite a bit more leverage today. And the second reason there's more concern is that there have recently been some indications that there is a somewhat higher level of tolerance with regard to debt levels, especially government debt. And that is mainly related to the fact that we have seen low inflation and low interest rates now for a long time. And some would argue that this might last much longer. And if that's the case, then of course debt won't be as hard to service. So it's only natural to think that we can keep spending more and worry less about what that means for our indebtedness.
So Bart, we tackle this question on our monthly virtual panel, Window On, with some key experts from both within the Conference Board and outside. Listeners can go to the full hour of this fascinating conversation on global debt at our website, conferenceboard.org, and I'll also put the link in the show notes below. But in this podcast, we really want to feature on some of the highlights of that session. Bart, why is the rise in debt becoming an increasing concern?
Yeah, we asked our audience that actually, and almost everyone on the poll said that they were somewhat or strongly agreeing to the statement that a higher debt burden was a problem. Alan Auerbach, who's a professor at the University of California at Berkeley and one of our guest panelists, linked that concern directly to the increased lack of fiscal discipline in many economies and also the rise of populist thinking.
One of the reasons why I'm concerned is I think there's been a change in the political climate. There are several countries one can think of where the results of past attempts at fiscal consolidation have contributed to the populist movement. Italy is a perfect example, I think. But it's also true in the United Kingdom, where the conservative government coming out of the financial crisis made significant budget cuts in the interest of fiscal responsibility, and I think it's had very considerable political fallout. And so in a number of countries, and look at what's happened in France recently with attempts at tax increases, I think in a number of countries there's much less public appetite or acceptance for fiscal responsibility, and I think that means that there's probably governments will have less scope or interest in controlling their fiscal trajectory.
Now, of course, we need to be a little bit more specific what we're talking about when it comes to debt. I asked Joe Minerick, who's the Senior Research Director at the Committee for Economic Development in Washington, also a panelist, whether we should be more concerned about government debt, which is the main category of debt that has increased compared to household or corporate debt. And this is what he had to say.
There are all kinds of risks. Clearly, those who are lending money to households and to businesses are doing so on the expectation that there are some risks in there. There will be some bad news, and portfolios are allocated to take account of that. On the government side, we aren't so much worried about defaults because governments have printing presses. But what we do have to worry about is the fact that we really do have a political environment in which, as I believe Alan mentioned earlier, there's much less concern about fiscal responsibility. As a result, as this debt grows, what we're seeing is the potential not necessarily of a default or an explosion, but a crowding out of necessary expenditures by government to help to build their economies, and a crowding out of productive private investment. So gradually, we're seeing the possibility of an erosion of economic performance that could very well be debilitating to a very serious degree, even if it falls short of an actual debt explosion or a sovereign default.
Our third panelist, Kat Levanon, put some further color on this issue of the rising government debt by explaining we should not just think about the debt, but also about the ability to service the debt. So let's listen to that segment.
When we look at the debt, we should also look at debt service, because to some degree, by just looking at debt levels, we are overestimating the impact debt has on the economy right now because interest rates are so low. And in fact, if you look at debt service at the household sector now, it's historically low. And even in the government, even though the debt rate is historically high, the share of GDP that is devoted to paying interest on government debt is not out of line with historical norms. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But I think the increase in the debt is, as we discussed earlier, it's not just about now, it's what's likely to happen in the future, and a combination of irresponsible governments and kind of the natural increase in Medicare and Social Security will bring this blue line much higher than it is now to a more dangerous territory.
But there's another side to this, as Alan Auerbach argued.
It's certainly true that it's easier to borrow and sustain higher debt levels while interest rates are low, and particularly while economies are not particularly strong. I think it's just a question of how one interprets that license to borrow. And the concern I have is that while a regulated response to lower interest rates might be appropriate, the political systems often don't deal with that kind of subtlety very well.
That was some fascinating discussion on the panel about the rising debt in a variety of countries, including China, for example. But much of the discussion is focused on the United States. So the question, of course, is to what extent is the U.S. a bit of a special case here? Correct.
The U.S., of course, holds the world's main reserve currency, and most capital flows are denominated in U.S. dollars. And as such, the U.S. has a pretty big clout over the monetary policies of other countries too. But there are some clear warning signs to take into account.
I'm sure you've all heard the statement that the United States in the financial world is the best-looking horse in the glue factory. The issue that about which I think we have to be afraid is that we just don't know what would happen if the issuer of the world's reserve currency, for some reason or other, came to be held in less repute. The fact that our securities are reserves suggests that we've got a longer way to fall if we ever do lose that status.
So Bart, you mentioned earlier that despite the rise in global debt, the degree of tolerance for debt may have somewhat loosened recently. Can you speak a little more to that?
Sure. 10 years ago, at the height of the financial crisis, two academics, Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt, published a history of high debt episodes and how countries responded to that. And that book was titled "This Time is Different." And that was really meant as an antiphrase because there's always some often unjustified reason to loosen up a little more with regard to debt. As mentioned today, that reason is low inflation and low interest rates. And if those two things are not just a temporary matter, but more a kind of long-term phenomenon, then maybe a higher debt level can be tolerated. It was interesting to see when we first asked if people were concerned about that, almost everyone agreed with that. But when we asked next whether we should reconsider some of our concerns given those lower interest and inflation rates, the responses were much more nuanced.
So there are some newer theories out there that have really bubbled up into conscious recently, including the so-called modern monetary policy that underpoint that last point you mentioned.
Right. It's interesting that you say the so-called modern monetary theory, because some of those ideas actually go back quite some time. But the basic idea of MMT, as it is called, is that central banks can add to the money supply essentially by printing money and allowing governments to pay for additional fiscal spending.
So when you lay it out like that, it doesn't sound all that original or really all that modern. It's been tried before.
Yes, and with some dire consequences. But there's an interesting twist in what the supporters of the modern monetary theory say. They don't deny that high inflation or high debt is a problem, but they argue that it should not be our primary guide to determine spending levels. Instead, the primary constraint on spending is to match the needs of society with the availability of labor and capital resources. So, for example, if we need to spend more on healthcare or on the green economy, we should do that up to the point that the economy cannot absorb more idle labor and capital involved with that spending. So only then inflation would rise and the government would have to reduce spending levels or increase taxes.
So what did your panel have to say about this idea?
Well, it didn't get a lot of high fives. Let's start with Alan Auerbach of Berkeley.
To the extent that this so-called new theory echoes many standard results, it's fine. It's not new, but it's fine. I've done work myself recently suggesting that accumulation of that fiscal expansion and accumulation of some debt when a country's in a deep recession is not only good for the economy but may not even be bad for the country's fiscal position. I think to jump from that, which is really a fairly traditional Keynesian view, to the idea that debt doesn't matter because you can have the central bank buy it. I think there's a pretty big jump between those 2 points, and to the extent that people are using this new theory to justify huge increases in government spending and saying you don't have to worry about it, I think makes no sense at all.
Okay, so that idea clearly doesn't seem to fly. But the reality, of course, is that we have seen very low interest rates for a long time. So while there are limits to spending, there might also be a little room for a little more spending, right? So is there some critical level, Bart, where things turn into a more dangerous setting?
Well, first, there are other ways to think about this than the modern monetary theory. And one other idea that has been going around for a while is that of secular stagnation. And that essentially argues that low interest rates do require more active fiscal policies. This looks at the issue much more from a demand perspective, arguing that slow demand is the critical factor determining slow growth. So let's listen to Gaz Levanon's comments on that.
Secular stagnation was the idea, as you mentioned, that interest rates for various reasons are much lower than they used to be. And in some periods, they are below zero, which is impossible to achieve. So then we simply will not be in a kind of an equilibrium of full employment. That's what Summers started arguing in 2013, and 5 years later, we have the lowest unemployment rate since the 1960s. So he clearly missed something, and I think what he missed is the supply side of the economy and the fact that there is almost no growth in labor force and working age population.
And this is what Joe Minerick had to say about how we might reach a critical level of that.
If you think about the possibility of criticality, and it's a probability question. There is no point out there where you could see the wall and you know where the problem is. What makes this problem a matter of concern, beyond the fact that we are crowding out productive private investment and we're crowding out productive public investment as we go. But what makes this an issue is that the financial markets will likely behave in the same way as people in a crowded theater who begin to smell smoke. You don't organize a careful walk to the door with people 2 by 2. If you think there's a problem and there's a fire in the theater, you get up and run because you know if you don't get through the door early, you might not get through the door at all. That, to me, is the fact that this can set a spark is what makes this situation so much a matter of
Alan,
concern.
what you
Thinking of our member companies here at the conference board, what should they be concerned about when facing these high debt levels?
Well, we asked that question both to our audience and to our panelists. And our audience picked a lot of different possibilities. But interestingly, their main focus was on what they could control. So they were concerned of risk of business failure because of their own rising corporate debt. They were also concerned about the crowding out of private investment by public investment. But our panelists put some interesting color to this. Here's Professor Alan Auerbach again.
I would actually put at the top of the list something that the group of people on this call have not ranked high, which is no ability to respond fiscally in times of recession. I'll say why I'm worried about that. First of all, the signs are that the U.S. economy is weakening. We know that's happening in Europe as well, and we know it's happening in China. And so even though one doesn't want to predict a recession, I think there's certainly a heightened possibility of recession in the next year or so. And if we enter a recession with large budget deficits and interest rates still very low, at least the policy rate of the Fed, then we're really going to be in a bad way in terms of our ability to deal with a recession. I mean, if we think what we did during the global financial crisis, admittedly a very bad recession, we had, at least initially, the ability to have a monetary response. We had a fiscal response. We probably should have had a stronger one, but nevertheless, it was a sizable response. And if both of those instruments are not available to us, particularly if we have a debt to GDP ratio near 100% and going over it, in the process of going over it without any changes in policy, I really worry that we're going to be in a situation where we don't deal very effectively with a recession.
And let's close with Joe Minerick's comment on what business can do about this themselves.
I suspect that businesses are also looking very carefully at consumer demand and the prospects that demand will be strong, and that, of course, includes the state of consumer debt as well. I do think that the problem of public debt is one where we really do need business input into the public debate to make it clear that we need to take action before it's too late, and with an understanding that, as Alan said a moment ago, business is probably going to have to put some chips on the table to find a solution. Unfortunately, that's the reality we're dealing with. It is very easy to play a game of chicken and say, what I want is for everybody else to sacrifice to solve the collective problem, but leave me out. Statements like that, unfortunately, don't have an awful lot of credibility. I think people need to come forward and acknowledge that they are ready to chip into the pot to help.
Yeah, and you're describing exactly the mission of the Committee for Economic Development. That's exactly what you guys are doing. So that's well stated.
So thanks for these really interesting segments from the panel discussion, Bart. As we mentioned earlier, the full discussion can be watched on demand at our website, conferenceboard.org. Just go to webcasts and videos, or you can click on the link below. So this is a monthly program, Bart, our Window On series. What's the next episode going to be about?
So our next show is on April 24th, and then we will provide a window on Latin America. We've seen a lot of political upheaval in Latin America in the past 2 years, and even very recent. So we'll discuss with the audience and the panelists about the future of that region, both politically and economically, and also what it means for the United States.
So thanks, Bart. Anyone with interest on what's happening in Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, anywhere else, please join us. You can register for the program at the link below or on our website. And it is free and open to the public, and you'll join us on our next Indications with some takeaways from there. Thank you, Bart.
Thanks. Bye.
This has been Indications from the Conference Board.